Sarah Martinez had grown up believing she was nobody special. At 28, she worked as a night cleaner at the downtown office building, invisible to the important people who hurried past her in their expensive suits. Her small apartment barely had enough room for her and Max, an old German shepherd she had found limping in an alley 3 years ago. Max wasn't just any dog to Sarah. He had appeared in her life during the darkest time, right after she had aged out of the foster care system with nowhere to go. The dog's gentle brown eyes seemed to understand her loneliness in a way no human ever had. Despite his age and the limp in his back leg, Max became her constant companion, her family, her hope. Sarah never knew her real parents. The social worker had told her she was found as a baby outside St. Mary's Hospital with nothing but a pink blanket and a note that said, "Please take care of my angel." For 28 years, she had wondered who she really was, but the trail had always gone cold. Working nights meant Sarah saw a different side of the corporate world. While cleaning the executive floors, she often noticed the framed photos on expensive desks, the awards on walls, the life of privilege she could never imagine having. One office belonged to Richard Blackstone, the CEO of Blackstone Industries, one of the most powerful men in the city. His office was filled with portraits of himself with politicians, celebrities, and business leaders. What struck Sarah most about Richard Blackstone's office was how cold it felt, despite all the luxury. There were no family photos, no personal touches that suggested warmth or love, just power and money displayed like trophies. She had seen him a few times, always surrounded by assistants, always in a hurry, never making eye contact with people like her. Max had been getting weaker lately. The veterinarian had given Sarah the heartbreaking news last month. The old dog had cancer and there wasn't much time left. Sarah couldn't afford expensive treatments on her cleaning salary, but she was determined to make Max's final months as comfortable as possible. Every morning after work, Sarah would take Max to the small park near their apartment. The dog moved slowly now, but his tail still wagged when he saw the birds and squirrels. Other dog owners would sometimes chat with Sarah, but she mostly kept to herself. Trust didn't come easily to someone who had been forgotten by the world so many times. The building where Sarah worked was a maze of secrets. Late at night when she cleaned the offices, she sometimes overheard phone calls or saw documents left on desks. She never paid much attention, but recently she had begun to notice strange patterns. Files would appear and disappear, important-looking papers would be shredded, and certain offices would be locked even during her cleaning hours. Richard Blackstone's office was one of those mysterious places. His assistant, a sharp woman named Victoria, would often stay late making sure everything was perfect before the CEO arrived the next morning. Victoria treated Sarah like furniture, barely acknowledging her presence. But Sarah had learned to be invisible long ago. One evening, while Sarah was emptying the trash in the executive break room, she overheard Victoria on a phone call. The conversation was strange, filled with references to the investigation and documents that need to disappear. Victoria's voice was tense, worried in a way that seemed unusual for someone so confident. Max had been acting strangely too. Instead of waiting patiently while Sarah worked, he had started wandering the halls, sniffing at certain doors and whimpering softly. Dogs had instincts that humans often ignored, and Max seemed to sense something was wrong in the building. Sarah's life had taught her to notice things others missed. Foster homes had made her observant, always watching for signs of danger or change. She noticed when people were lying, when situations weren't what they seemed, when adults had secrets they didn't want children to know. The building felt different lately, charged with tension that Sarah couldn't quite identify. Security had been increased with new guards who watched everyone more carefully. Even the other cleaning staff had commented on the changes, though none of them knew what was causing the shift in atmosphere. Richard Blackstone himself seemed different too. The few times Sarah had glimpsed him recently, he looked tired, stressed in a way that expensive suits couldn't hide. His usual confident stride had been replaced by quick, nervous movements, and he seemed to be looking over his shoulder more often. Sarah's apartment building was in a rough neighborhood, the kind of place where people minded their own business and didn't ask too many questions. Her neighbors were mostly other forgotten people, working multiple jobs, raising children alone, surviving on hope and stubbornness. They looked out for each other in small ways, sharing food when money was tight, watching each other's backs when trouble came around. Max loved their neighborhood despite its flaws. He knew every sound, every smell, every person who belonged there. Lately, though, he had been more protective of Sarah, staying closer to her side, growling softly at strangers who paid too much attention to them. The veterinarian had explained that Max's cancer was spreading quickly. Soon the pain would become unbearable, and Sarah would have to make the hardest decision of her life. The thought of losing her only family member filled her with a grief she could barely contain. At work, Sarah began to pay more attention to the strange activities around Richard Blackstone's office. File cabinets were being moved, computers were being replaced, and several times she had seen men in dark suits having hushed conversations in the hallways after hours. Victoria had started working even later, often staying until Sarah finished her shift at dawn. The assistant's usual perfect appearance was showing signs of strain, with dark circles under her eyes and a tension in her shoulders that suggested she was carrying a heavy burden. Sarah's instincts, sharpened by years of navigating a world that didn't care about her, were telling her that something big was about to happen. The building felt like a pot about to boil over, and she found herself caught in the middle of something she didn't understand. Max's condition was deteriorating faster than expected. Some mornings he could barely lift his head from his bed. Sarah would sit with him before work, stroking his graying fur and whispering promises that everything would be okay, even though she knew time was running out. The combination of losing Max and the strange atmosphere at work was wearing Sarah down. She had survived so much in her life, but the thought of being completely alone again terrified her in ways she couldn't admit, even to herself. Little did Sarah know that the threads of her life were about to intersect with forces beyond her imagination, and that Max, even in his final days, would lead her toward a truth that would change everything she thought she knew about herself. The night everything changed started like any other. Sarah arrived at the Blackstone Industries building at midnight, her cleaning cart squeaking down the marble hallways. Max had been too weak to walk that evening, so she had carried him to Mrs. Chen's apartment next door, where the elderly woman had agreed to watch him. Mrs. Chen had looked worried when Sarah handed over Max's medication schedule. The old woman spoke broken English, but her eyes communicated what words couldn't. They both knew Max was dying, and tonight might be one of his last. Sarah tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting to Max lying on Mrs. Chen's couch, breathing slowly and painfully. The building felt emptier than usual, with most of the security guards stationed on the lower floors for some reason she didn't understand. When she reached the executive floor, Sarah noticed that Richard Blackstone's office door was slightly open. This never happened. Victoria always made sure everything was locked tight before leaving. Sarah approached carefully, her cleaning supplies rattling softly as she walked. Through the crack in the door, she could see papers scattered across the usually pristine desk. File drawers were pulled open, and it looked like someone had been searching through everything quickly and carelessly. Sarah's foster home instincts kicked in, warning her that this was the kind of situation where innocent people got blamed for things they didn't do. She was about to back away when she heard voices coming from the stairwell. Multiple people were climbing the stairs quietly, trying not to make noise. Sarah's heart began to race. She had learned long ago that when adults tried to be sneaky, children and people like her were usually in danger. Without thinking, Sarah slipped into Richard Blackstone's office and closed the door behind her. She crouched behind the massive leather chair, trying to make herself invisible the way she had learned to do as a child when foster parents argued, or when social workers came with bad news. The voices got closer, and Sarah could hear at least 3 different people talking in hushed tones. One voice belonged to Victoria, but she sounded different, scared and angry at the same time. The other voices were male, unfamiliar, with the kind of authority that made Sarah's stomach clench with old fears. "We need those documents tonight," one of the men was saying. "The federal investigation starts tomorrow, and if they find what we think Blackstone has hidden, we're all going down with him." Sarah's mind raced. Federal investigation? She had heard those words before, during her childhood when one of her foster fathers had been arrested for fraud. It meant serious trouble, the kind that could destroy lives. "I told you I can't find them," Victoria's voice was strained. "Richard moved everything before he disappeared. The only person who might know where they are is his lawyer, and he's not talking." Disappeared? Sarah realized that she hadn't seen Richard Blackstone in the building for over a week. She had assumed he was traveling, but now she understood that something much more serious was happening. "What about the storage units?" another male voice asked. "His assistant before you mentioned he kept personal files in off-site storage." "I never had access to that information," Victoria replied. Richard didn't trust anyone completely, not even me. Sarah remained perfectly still, barely breathing. She had learned this skill in foster homes where being noticed often meant being blamed for something. The voices moved closer to the office door and she could hear them trying the handle. "It's locked," Victoria said, sounding puzzled. "I always lock it, but check it anyway," one of the men ordered. "We need to search everywhere." Sarah heard keys jangling and panic flooded through her body. There was nowhere to hide in the office except under the desk, but that would only work if they didn't look too carefully. She crawled silently across the carpet, grateful for all the time she had practiced moving without making sound. The door opened just as Sarah managed to squeeze herself into the small space under Richard Blackstone's desk. Her heart was beating so loudly she was sure they would hear it. But the three people who entered the office seemed focused on their search. From her hiding spot, Sarah could see their feet and legs. Victoria wore her usual expensive heels, but she was pacing nervously instead of walking with her normal confidence. The two men wore dark suits and moved with purpose, opening drawers and cabinets with practiced efficiency. "The safe is empty," one man announced. "Looks like he cleared it out before he ran." "This doesn't make sense," Victoria said, her voice cracking slightly. Richard was paranoid about keeping records. He documented everything, said it was insurance against people who might try to betray him. Sarah filed this information away automatically. Growing up in the system had taught her to listen carefully to adult conversations, because children were rarely told the truth about important things that affected their lives. "Maybe he destroyed everything," the second man suggested. "No," Victoria said firmly. "Richard never destroyed anything. He believed information was power and he hoarded it like other people collect coins. Those documents exist somewhere." The search continued for what felt like hours. Sarah's legs began to cramp from staying in the same position, but she didn't dare move. Through the small gap between the desk drawers, she could see the three people becoming increasingly frustrated. "We're running out of time," one of the men said. "The feds will be here in the morning, and if they find what we think exists, we're all looking at prison time." "What exactly are we looking for?" Victoria asked. "You keep talking about documents, but you haven't told me specifically what Richard might have hidden." There was a long pause before one of the men answered. "Financial records that could implicate some very powerful people in some very illegal activities. Let's just say that Richard Blackstone wasn't the only one bending the law to make money." Sarah's mind was spinning. She was witnessing something that could be dangerous for her to know. In foster care, she had learned that being in the wrong place at the wrong time could ruin your life, even if you hadn't done anything wrong. "Check his computer again," Victoria suggested. "Maybe there's something hidden in the files." As they moved around the desk, Sarah pressed herself even smaller into the cramped space. One of the men sat in Richard Blackstone's chair, directly above where she was hiding. She could smell his cologne and hear him typing on the computer keyboard. "Password protected," he muttered, "and not the usual obvious ones." "Try his birthday," Victoria suggested. "Already did. Social security number, mother's maiden name, all the standard options." Sarah listened to them try dozens of passwords without success. Part of her wanted to suggest they try the date on one of the certificates hanging on the wall, but she knew that speaking would reveal her presence and probably get her into more trouble than she could handle. After another hour of fruitless searching, the three people finally gave up. Sarah heard them discussing plans to return the next night, and then their voices faded as they left the office. She waited another 20 minutes before carefully emerging from under the desk. Her body ached from the cramped position, and her mind was reeling from everything she had heard. Sarah knew she was now in possession of information that could be dangerous, but she had no idea what to do with it. As she gathered her cleaning supplies and tried to make the office look normal again, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the federal investigation and the missing Richard Blackstone. She had always been invisible to people like him, but now their worlds were colliding in ways she never could have imagined. The building felt different as she finished her work that night. Every shadow seemed to hide potential danger, and every sound made her jump. Sarah had learned to survive by staying out of other people's business, but now she was trapped in the middle of something that could change her life forever. Sarah rushed home that morning with her mind spinning from everything she had witnessed. Mrs. Chen met her at the door with tears in her eyes, and Sarah's heart dropped before the older woman even spoke. "Mac's very sick tonight," Mrs. Chen said softly, her broken English heavy with sadness. "He keep looking for you, making small crying sounds. I think maybe time to say goodbye." Sarah found Max lying on Mrs. Chen's couch, his breathing shallow and labored. His once bright eyes were clouded with pain, but they still lit up slightly when he saw her. She knelt beside him, stroking his graying fur while trying not to cry. "Hey, boy," she whispered. "I'm here now. Everything's going to be okay." But she knew it wasn't true. Max was dying, and she had to face the reality that her only family member was leaving her. The timing felt especially cruel, coming on the same night she had stumbled into something that could be dangerous for both of them. Mrs. Chen helped Sarah carry Max back to their apartment. The old dog was too weak to walk, but he seemed more peaceful once he was back in familiar surroundings. Sarah set up a comfortable bed for him near the window where he liked to watch the street activity. As she sat with Max, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about what she had overheard in Richard Blackstone's office. Federal investigation, missing documents, powerful people involved in illegal activities. She had grown up in a world where adults made decisions that affected children's lives without explaining anything. But this felt different. This felt dangerous. Max seemed to sense her anxiety. Despite his weakness, he managed to lift his head and rested on her lap, the same way he had comforted her during countless difficult nights over the past 3 years. His presence reminded her that some relationships were pure and simple, unlike the complicated adult world that surrounded them. That afternoon, Sarah couldn't sleep despite her exhaustion. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Victoria's frightened voice and the men's urgent whispers about federal agents and prison time. She had always been good at staying invisible, but now she possessed information that made her feel exposed and vulnerable. Around noon, her phone rang. It was her supervisor from the cleaning company, and his voice sounded tense. "Sarah, I need you to come in early tonight. There's been some changes at the Blackstone building, and we need to do a thorough cleaning of the executive floors before some important people arrive tomorrow." Sarah's stomach clenched. Important people? Government types, I think. "Look, just get there by 10 instead of midnight, and make sure everything is spotless. This could mean a big contract for us if we do it right." After hanging up, Sarah realized that the federal investigation she had heard about was beginning. She would be in the building when the agents arrived, cleaning around people who were looking for the same documents that Victoria and her companions had been desperately searching for. Max's breathing became more difficult as the day wore on. Sarah called the veterinarian's office, and the receptionist gently explained that it was time to consider letting Max go peacefully. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, but she knew they were right. "Can the doctor come here?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "I don't want Max to die in a strange place." "Of course," the receptionist said kindly. "Dr. Williams can be there this evening around 6 o'clock. Sarah spent the afternoon with Max, talking to him about their life together, thanking him for being her family when she had no one else. She told him about the strange things happening at work because Max had always been her best listener. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with the things I heard last night," she whispered to him. "I've always tried to stay out of trouble, but now trouble seems to have found me." Max's tail moved slightly, as if he was trying to comfort her one last time. Dr. Williams arrived promptly at 6, a kind woman who had treated Max since Sarah first found him. She explained the process gently, assuring Sarah that Max wouldn't feel any pain. "You've given him a wonderful life," Dr. Williams said as she prepared the injection. "He's been loved, and that's what matters most." Sarah held Max's head in her hands as Dr. Williams administered the medication. The old dog looked into her eyes with what seemed like gratitude and peace. Within moments, his breathing stopped, and the pain that had been written across his features disappeared. "He's free now," Dr. Williams said softly, giving Sarah time to say her final goodbye. After the veterinarian left, Sarah sat with Max's still form for a long time. The apartment felt impossibly empty without the sound of his breathing or the gentle thump of his tail. She had been alone before, but never like this, never with such a complete sense of loss. Mrs. Chen knocked on the door around 8 o'clock, bringing tea and homemade soup. The elderly woman didn't speak much English, but she understood grief in any language. She sat with Sarah in comfortable silence, occasionally patting her shoulder in a maternal way that Sarah had rarely experienced. "Max, good dog," Mrs. Chen said finally. "He know you love him. Now he watching over you from better place." Sarah wanted to believe that, but the practical reality was that she was now completely alone in a world that had never shown much interest in her welfare. And tonight, she had to return to work, to the building where federal agents would soon be investigating crimes she didn't fully understand. As she prepared to leave for work, Sarah looked at Max's empty bed and felt a wave of grief so intense it nearly knocked her down. She had lost the only living being who had ever loved her unconditionally, and now she had to face whatever danger was waiting at the Blackstone building without him. The walk to work felt different without Max at her side. For 3 years, he had been her companion on these late-night journeys through the city streets. Now the shadows seemed darker, the sounds more threatening, the world more hostile to someone like her. When Sarah arrived at the building, she could see additional security cars parked outside and men in suits walking through the lobby with serious expressions. The federal investigation was beginning, and she was about to find herself in the middle of something that could destroy her carefully constructed but fragile life. As she entered the building with her cleaning cart, Sarah made a decision. She would do her job, keep her head down, and try to stay invisible the way she always had. But if Max had taught her anything during their time together, it was that sometimes the most important battles were the ones you fought to protect the people you loved. Even though Max was gone, Sarah realized that she still had something worth protecting, herself, and maybe, if she was brave enough, the truth that powerful people were trying to hide. The elevator doors closed behind her as she headed toward the executive floors, carrying not just her cleaning supplies but also the weight of secrets that could change everything, if she could figure out what to do with them. The building buzzed with unusual activity when Sarah arrived for her early shift. Federal agents were setting up equipment in the lobby, and she could see them preparing for what looked like a major investigation. Her grief over Max mixed with anxiety about being so close to whatever was about to unfold. Sarah tried to focus on her work, but every sound made her jump. The agents were professional and polite, but their presence filled the building with tension. She kept remembering the frightened voices from the night before, wondering if Victoria and her companions knew how close the investigation was to beginning. On the executive floor, Sarah noticed that several office doors were sealed with official tape. Richard Blackstone's office was among them, and she realized that the federal agents would soon be searching the same space where she had hidden and overheard the desperate conversation about missing documents. As she cleaned around the sealed offices, Sarah found herself thinking about Max and wishing he was there to guide her instincts. The old dog had always seemed to sense when something was wrong, and right now she felt lost without his presence. Around midnight, Sarah was emptying trash bins on the lower floors when she overheard 2 federal agents talking near the elevators. They were discussing their search strategy and mentioned that they were looking for financial records that could expose a network of corruption involving several prominent businessmen and politicians. Blackstone was the record keeper, one agent said. "If we can find his files, we can unravel the whole operation." "Any word on his whereabouts?" the second agent asked, still missing. "His lawyer claims he doesn't know where Blackstone went, but we think he's hiding somewhere until he can figure out how to destroy the evidence." Sarah continued her work, but her mind was racing. The documents that Victoria and the mysterious men had been searching for were the same ones the federal agents needed. Somewhere, Richard Blackstone had hidden evidence that could expose powerful people and possibly send them to prison. As she worked through the night, Sarah began to notice things that others might miss. She had spent years being invisible in the world, which meant she had developed skills in observation that most people never learned. She noticed that certain agents seemed more focused on specific areas of the building, and she overheard fragments of conversations that suggested they had some idea of where Blackstone might have hidden important documents. Around 3 in the morning, Sarah was cleaning near the executive conference room when she overheard a phone conversation between one of the lead agents and someone at their headquarters. "We're going to need warrants for his storage units," the agent was saying. "His financial records show payments to 3 different facilities around the city." Sarah remembered Victoria mentioning storage units during the previous night's conversation. It seemed like everyone was looking in the same direction, but no one had found what they were searching for yet. As dawn approached, Sarah finished her shift and prepared to leave the building. The federal agents were setting up for a long day of investigation, and she could see them preparing to search Richard Blackstone's office thoroughly. Walking home through the empty streets, Sarah felt the full weight of Max's absence. The city seemed different without him, less safe somehow, more lonely than she had ever remembered feeling. She had survived being alone before, but losing Max felt like losing the last connection she had to anything that mattered. Back in her apartment, Sarah sat in the chair where she used to watch Max sleep. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the sounds of the city waking up outside her window. She tried to sleep, but her mind kept cycling through everything she had heard over the past 2 nights. That afternoon, Sarah was awakened by a knock at her door. Through the peephole, she could see a woman in a business suit holding a badge. Sarah's heart began to race, wondering if somehow the federal agents had discovered her presence during their investigation. "Ms. Martinez, I'm Agent Jennifer Walsh with the FBI. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your work at the Blackstone Industries building." Sarah opened the door, trying to appear calm despite the panic she felt inside. Agent Walsh was a woman in her 40s with kind but serious eyes, the type of person who probably saw through lies easily, but might be fair if you told her the truth. "I'm not in trouble, am I?" Sarah asked, her voice smaller than she intended. "Not at all," Agent Walsh assured her. "We're talking to all the building employees to get a complete picture of activity in the weeks before our investigation began." "May I come in?" Sarah nodded and stepped aside, suddenly aware of how small and shabby her apartment was compared to the world these federal agents normally inhabited. Agent Walsh sat down and pulled out a notebook, but her demeanor remained friendly rather than intimidating. "How long have you worked cleaning the Blackstone building?" Agent Walsh asked. "Almost 2 years," Sarah replied, sitting across from her. "I work the night shift, midnight to 6 in the morning. Have you noticed any unusual activity recently? People working late who normally don't? Conversations that seemed out of place, anything that struck you as odd?" Sarah hesitated, knowing that this was the moment when she had to decide how much to reveal. She had spent her life avoiding attention from authorities, but now she was being directly asked to help with something that seemed important. "There have been more people working late," Sarah said carefully, "and some offices that are usually locked tight have had people in them at strange hours." Agent Walsh nodded, making notes. "Anyone in particular? Any conversations you might have overheard?" This was the critical moment. Sarah could tell Agent Walsh about the conversation she had witnessed, about Victoria, and the mysterious men searching for the same documents the FBI was looking for. But doing so would also mean admitting that she had been hiding in Richard Blackstone's office when she wasn't supposed to be there. "I try not to listen to conversations," Sarah said finally. "People don't usually notice cleaning staff, so I hear things sometimes, but I don't pay much attention." Agent Walsh studied Sarah's face, and Sarah got the feeling that the agent knew she was holding something back. But instead of pressing harder, Agent Walsh's expression softened. "Ms. Martinez, I want you to know that if you have information that could help our investigation, sharing it would be the right thing to do. We're trying to expose corruption that has hurt a lot of people, and every piece of information matters." Sarah felt torn between her instinct to stay invisible and a growing sense that maybe, for once in her life, she could do something that mattered. Agent Walsh seemed genuinely interested in justice rather than just making arrests. "If someone overheard conversations about missing documents and people trying to find them before you did," Sarah said slowly, "would that person be in danger for knowing about it?" Agent Walsh leaned forward slightly. "That would depend on the specific situation, but we take witness protection very seriously. If someone has information that could help our investigation, we would make sure they were safe." Sarah took a deep breath, thinking about Max and how he had always seemed to encourage her to be brave when it mattered most. Maybe this was one of those times when staying invisible wasn't the right choice. "I think I might have overheard something that could be important," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. "But I'm scared about what might happen if certain people find out I was there." Agent Walsh closed her notebook and looked directly at Sarah. "Why don't you tell me what you heard, and we'll figure out together how to keep you safe while making sure justice is done." For the first time since Max died, Sarah felt like maybe she wasn't completely alone in the world after all. Sarah told Agent Walsh everything. She described hiding under Richard Blackstone's desk, overhearing Victoria and the 2 men desperately searching for documents, and their fear about the federal investigation. As she spoke, Agent Walsh took careful notes, occasionally asking for clarification but never making Sarah feel judged for being in the office when she shouldn't have been. You said one of the men mentioned that Richard Blackstone documented everything as insurance against betrayal? Agent Walsh asked. Yes, Sarah confirmed. Victoria seemed to think he was paranoid about keeping records, like he didn't trust anyone completely. Agent Walsh nodded thoughtfully. That matches what we've learned about Blackstone's personality. He was involved in some very questionable business deals, but he was smart enough to keep evidence that could protect him if his partners tried to throw him under the bus. What kind of business deals? Sarah asked. Money laundering, mostly. Blackstone's companies were used to clean money from various illegal activities for some very powerful people. When those people decided he knew too much and became a liability, Blackstone realized he was in danger. Sarah felt a chill. So he disappeared because people wanted to hurt him? We think so. But before he vanished, he hid evidence that could expose the entire network. That's what everyone is looking for, including us. Agent Walsh explained that the investigation had been building for months. They had enough evidence to know that crimes had been committed, but they needed Blackstone's detailed records to identify all the participants and prove their guilt in court. The problem is that Blackstone was too smart to keep everything in obvious places, Agent Walsh continued. We've searched his offices, his home, his known bank accounts. The storage units you heard mentioned are our next target, but so far we haven't found the main cache of documents. Sarah hesitated before asking her next question. What happens to people who help investigations like this? That depends, Agent Walsh said honestly. Sometimes witnesses can go back to their normal lives once the case is resolved. Sometimes, if they're in danger, we help them start over somewhere safe with new identities. The idea of starting over both terrified and intrigued Sarah. She had spent her whole life being nobody special, invisible to the world around her. The thought of becoming someone completely different was overwhelming, but maybe it would also be a chance to finally have the kind of life she had only dreamed about. Agent Walsh's phone rang, and she answered it quietly. Sarah couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see the agent's expression become more serious as she listened. We need to move faster than expected, Agent Walsh said after hanging up. Our sources indicate that some of the people involved in this conspiracy are planning to leave the country within the next few days. If they run, we might never get another chance to prosecute them. What does that mean for me? Sarah asked. It means that the information you overheard could be crucial to stopping them. Victoria and those men she was with, they might be our best lead to finding where Blackstone hid his records. Agent Walsh asked Sarah to describe the men's voices in as much detail as possible. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to remember every word of the conversation she had overheard while hiding under the desk. One of them had an accent, maybe from the South, Sarah said, and he seemed to be in charge, making decisions about what they should search next. The other man? Younger sounding, nervous. He kept asking questions about passwords and computer files. Agent Walsh made more notes. Sarah, I need to ask you something important, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Would you be willing to help us by going back to work tonight and watching for these people? Sarah's stomach clenched with fear. You want me to spy on them? Not spy exactly, but if they come back to search the building again, we need to know about it immediately. You could wear a small recording device just in case you overhear anything else that might help us locate those documents. The request scared Sarah more than anything she had ever been asked to do. She had spent her entire life trying to stay safe by remaining invisible, and now Agent Walsh was asking her to deliberately put herself in danger. What if they catch me? Sarah asked. We'll have agents positioned throughout the building. If anything goes wrong, help will be there within seconds. Sarah thought about Max and how he had always seemed to encourage her to be brave. She thought about all the powerful people who had treated her like she was invisible and worthless throughout her life. Maybe this was her chance to prove that even forgotten people could make a difference. If I help you catch these criminals, will it really matter? Sarah asked. I mean, will it actually change anything for people like me? Agent Walsh considered the question seriously. Sarah, corruption like this hurts everyone, but it especially hurts people who don't have power or money to protect themselves. When rich people can break the law without consequences, it makes life harder for everyone else. Yes, helping us would matter. Sarah nodded slowly. What exactly would I need to do? Agent Walsh explained that Sarah would go to work as normal, but she would carry a small recording device that could transmit audio directly to federal agents stationed in the building. If Victoria and her companions returned to search for documents, Sarah would try to listen without putting herself in danger. The most important thing is your safety, Agent Walsh emphasized. If you feel threatened at any point, you signal us immediately and we'll get you out of there. That evening, Sarah prepared for work with a mixture of fear and determination she had never experienced before. Agent Walsh had given her a tiny microphone that clipped inside her shirt collar, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it specifically. Remember, we can hear everything you say and everything happening around you, Agent Walsh had told her. If you need help, just say the word assistance, and we'll know you're in trouble. As Sarah walked to the Blackstone building, she felt like she was stepping into a completely different life. For the first time, she wasn't just trying to survive or stay invisible. She was actively working to expose people who had used their power to hurt others. The building felt different that night. The federal agents had finished their initial search and moved their investigation to other locations, but Sarah could sense that the tension hadn't disappeared. Victoria's car was in the parking garage, which meant she was working late again. Sarah began her cleaning routine on the lower floors, testing the recording device by speaking softly to herself about what she was doing. Through her earpiece, Agent Walsh's voice confirmed that they could hear her clearly. Around 2 a.m, Sarah heard the same voices she had overheard 2 nights earlier. Victoria and the 2 men were back, and they sounded even more desperate than before. The feds searched everywhere, Victoria was saying as they walked past Sarah, who was cleaning a bathroom and pretended not to notice them. They didn't find anything, which means the documents are still hidden somewhere. Maybe Blackstone really did destroy them, one of the men suggested. No, Victoria said firmly. I worked for him for 5 years. He never threw anything away, ever. Those records exist and we have to find them before the government does. Sarah continued her work, moving slowly toward the executive floor while staying far enough behind the group to avoid suspicion. Through her earpiece, she could hear Agent Walsh coordinating with other agents positioned throughout the building. When the group reached Richard Blackstone's office, Sarah positioned herself in the supply closet across the hall, where she could hear their conversation while appearing to organize cleaning supplies. Try the computer again, Victoria instructed. Maybe there's something we missed. Sarah listened as they attempted to access Richard Blackstone's computer files. They tried hundreds of password combinations, growing more frustrated with each failure. Wait, one of the men said suddenly. What about that dog? Sarah's heart stopped. What dog? Victoria asked. Blackstone had photos of a German shepherd in his desk drawer. Remember? You mentioned it once, said it was weird because he never seemed like an animal person. Sarah felt a strange chill run through her body. Richard Blackstone had photos of a German shepherd? Could it possibly be Max? I remember, Victoria said slowly. He kept those photos separate from everything else, like they were important to him personally. Try the dog's name as a password, the man suggested. There was silence as Victoria typed on the computer. Then Sarah heard an intake of breath. That's it, Victoria whispered. We're in. As the group began accessing files on Richard Blackstone's computer, Sarah realized that somehow, impossibly, Max was connected to this entire situation. The dog she had found in an alley 3 years ago, the dog who had just died in her arms, was somehow part of a puzzle that involved one of the most powerful men in the city. Through her earpiece, Agent Walsh's voice was urgent but quiet. Sarah, can you get closer? We need to hear what they're finding. Sarah crept closer to the office door, her mind reeling with questions about Max and Richard Blackstone. How could her beloved dog be connected to this conspiracy? What secrets had Max been carrying without her ever knowing? As she listened to Victoria and the men discussing the files they had found, Sarah began to understand that the next few minutes would reveal truths that would see. Sarah pressed herself closer to the door, straining to hear every word as Victoria and the men explored Richard Blackstone's computer files. The revelation about Max being somehow connected to this situation had shaken her to her core, but she needed to understand what was happening. "There are dozens of folders here," Victoria said, her voice filled with relief and excitement. "Financial records, correspondence, meeting notes going back years. Look for anything about the offshore accounts," one of the men instructed. "Those are what the feds really want to find." Sarah listened as they clicked through files, occasionally reading excerpts aloud. The documents detailed a complex network of illegal financial transactions involving politicians, judges, and business leaders. The scope of the corruption was staggering, reaching into every level of government and business in the city. "Here," Victoria said suddenly. "There's a folder labeled Insurance Files. This has to be what we're looking for." As Victoria opened the folder, Sarah heard her gasp. "What is it?" one of the men asked. "These aren't just financial records," Victoria said, her voice shaking. "These are personal files. Photos, birth certificates, adoption records." Sarah's blood turned to ice. "Adoption records? Why would Blackstone keep adoption records?" the younger man asked. "Because one of the children in these files is his daughter," Victoria whispered. "A daughter he gave up for adoption 28 years ago." Sarah's legs nearly gave out beneath her. 28 years ago was when she was born. 28 years ago was when someone left a baby outside St. Mary's Hospital with nothing but a pink blanket and a note. "Look at this," Victoria continued, her voice barely audible. "The baby was left at St. Mary's Hospital on March 15, 1997. There are photos here and medical records and, oh my God, Sarah's birthday was March 15, 1997. She had been found at St. Mary's Hospital. Through her earpiece, she could hear Agent Walsh's urgent whisper, 'Sarah, what's happening?' "We're getting some audio, but it's unclear." Sarah couldn't respond. She was frozen in shock, trying to process what she was hearing. Richard Blackstone, the powerful CEO she had cleaned up after for 2 years, the man who was now missing and wanted by federal agents, was possibly her father. "There's more," Victoria said, her voice gaining strength. "The dog in the photos, it belonged to the baby's mother. When she died in a car accident, Blackstone couldn't handle raising the child alone, so he arranged for a private adoption that was never completed properly." Sarah remembered the social worker telling her that her case had unusual complications, that there were missing papers and legal questions that were never fully resolved. Now she understood why. "The mother's name was Elena Martinez," Victoria continued reading. "She was a secretary at one of Blackstone's companies. The relationship was secret because he was married at the time. Martinez, Sarah's last name, the name given to her by the social services system because no other name was available. It had belonged to her mother all along, but why keep all this?" one of the men asked. "Why risk having these personal documents mixed in with the criminal evidence?" "Because the adoption was illegal," Victoria said grimly. "Blackstone paid bribes to cover up the irregular paperwork. If this ever came out, it would be another criminal charge against him." Sarah's mind was reeling. Not only was Richard Blackstone possibly her father, but her entire life story was built on criminal activity. The adoption system that had failed her so completely had been corrupted from the very beginning. "There's something else," Victoria said, her voice now filled with a different kind of excitement. "According to these files, the daughter has a legal claim to Blackstone's estate. If he's declared legally dead or incapacitated, she would inherit everything." "How much is everything?" the younger man asked. "Hundreds of millions of dollars," Victoria replied, "plus properties, businesses, investments. The girl would be one of the richest people in the country." Sarah felt like she was drowning. In the space of a few minutes, she had learned that she might be the daughter of a criminal mastermind and the potential inheritor of a vast fortune built on illegal activities. "Where is she now?" one of the men asked. "According to the last update in these files, she was working as a cleaning person in this very building," Victoria said. "Her name is Sarah Martinez, and she has no idea who she really is." Sarah's heart stopped. They knew. They knew exactly who she was and where to find her. "We need to find her," Victoria said urgently. "If the feds discover these adoption records, they'll put her in protective custody, and we'll lose our chance to make a deal with her." "What kind of deal?" the younger man asked. "Think about it," Victoria explained. "She's lived in poverty her entire life. If we offer her a few $1,000,000 to help us access Blackstone's hidden accounts, she might be willing to cooperate." "And if she's not willing?" the older man asked. There was a long pause before Victoria answered. Then we'll have to make sure she doesn't become a problem for us." The threat in Victoria's voice was clear. Sarah realized that her life was now in immediate danger. These people knew who she was, where she worked, and probably where she lived. If she couldn't help them get what they wanted, they would eliminate her. Through her earpiece, Agent Walsh's voice was urgent. "Sarah, we heard everything. We're moving in now. Get away from that door immediately." But as Sarah tried to back away from the office, she heard footsteps in the hallway behind her. Someone else was in the building, approaching from the stairwell. "Someone's coming," Victoria hissed from inside the office. Sarah was trapped between the office where 3 criminals were planning her fate and an unknown person approaching from behind. In the darkness of the hallway, she couldn't see who was coming, but she could hear heavy footsteps getting closer. The footsteps stopped just a few feet behind her, and a familiar voice spoke softly in the darkness. "Hello, Sarah." She turned around and found herself face to face with Richard Blackstone himself, the man who might be her father, the criminal the FBI was hunting, the person whose secrets had turned her entire world upside down. "I think it's time we had a conversation," he said quietly. "There are things you need to know about who you really are, and unfortunately we don't have much time." Behind her, Sarah could hear Victoria and the men realizing that someone else was in the building. In her earpiece, Agent Walsh was coordinating the movement of federal agents throughout the building. Sarah stood frozen between her possible father and the people who wanted to use or kill her, knowing that the next few minutes would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of everyone involved in a conspiracy that had been building for decades. Everything she had believed about her life was a lie, and now she had to decide who to trust in a situation where every choice could be her last. Richard Blackstone looked older than Sarah remembered from her glimpses of him in the building. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his eyes carried the weight of a man who had been running from consequences for weeks. But as he looked at her in the dim hallway light, his expression softened in a way that reminded her of how Max used to look at her. "You look like your mother," he said quietly. Elena had the same eyes, the same way of standing when she was scared but trying to be brave. Sarah's voice caught in her throat. "You're really my father?" "Yes," Richard said simply. "And I'm sorry for everything that happened to you because of my choices." From inside the office, Sarah could hear Victoria and the men realizing that Richard had returned. Their whispered conversation became urgent and frightened. "We need to move," Richard said, gently taking Sarah's arm. "The people in that office aren't just looking for documents. They're planning to hurt you, and I won't let that happen." Through her earpiece, Agent Walsh's voice was urgent. "Sarah, federal agents are in the building. Can you get to the stairwell?" But before Sarah could respond, Victoria's voice cut through the darkness from the office doorway. "Richard, is that you?" Victoria stepped into the hallway, followed by the 2 men. In the dim light, Sarah could see that one of them was holding a gun. "Victoria," Richard said calmly, positioning himself between Sarah and the 3 people. "I should have known you'd be involved in this." "You disappeared for weeks," Victoria said, her voice sharp with accusation. "We've been cleaning up your mess while you've been hiding like a coward." "I wasn't hiding," Richard replied. "I was protecting my daughter." "Your daughter?" Victoria laughed bitterly. "You mean the cleaning girl? The one you abandoned in a hospital parking lot?" Sarah felt a surge of anger at Victoria's dismissive tone. All her life, people had treated her like she was worthless, invisible, disposable. Even now, when they needed something from her, they couldn't hide their contempt. "I didn't abandon her," Richard said firmly. "I made sure she was safe when I realized how dangerous my life had become." "Safe?" Victoria's voice rose. "She's lived in poverty her entire life while you built an empire with dirty money. Money that legally belongs to her now," Richard said quietly. The man with the gun stepped forward. "Which is why we're going to make a deal. The girl helps us access your accounts and everyone walks away happy." "And if I refuse?" Sarah asked, finding her voice for the first time. "Then you don't walk away at all," the man replied coldly. In her earpiece, Sarah could hear the sounds of federal agents moving through the building, getting closer to their location. She just needed to buy time until help arrived. "I want to know about my mother," Sarah said, looking directly at Richard. "I want to know about Elena." Richard's face softened again. "Elena was the most honest person I ever knew. She worked as a secretary in my company, and she was the only person who ever challenged me when I made questionable decisions." "Tell me about Max," Sarah said. Remembering the conversation she had overheard about the dog photos, Richard's eyes filled with tears. Max was Elena's dog. When she died in the car accident, he was the only thing left of her that I could give to you. But when I realized I had to place you for adoption, I couldn't bring myself to separate you from him too. Sarah's heart ached as the pieces fell into place. So you arranged for him to find me later? I had people watch over you through the years, Richard admitted. When you aged out of foster care and had nowhere to go, I made sure Max would be in that alley where you would find him. The revelation that Max's appearance in her life hadn't been random hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her beloved dog had been a gift from a father she never knew she had, a connection to a mother she had never known. This is very touching, Victoria interrupted sarcastically, but we have more practical matters to discuss. The sound of footsteps in the stairwell was getting closer. Sarah knew the federal agents were almost there, but the man with the gun was growing more nervous and dangerous with each passing second. There's something else you need to know, Richard said urgently to Sarah. The documents they're looking for, the evidence the FBI needs, it's not in any storage unit or computer file. What do you mean? Victoria demanded. Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device that looked like a USB drive. Everything is here. Every transaction, every bribe, every illegal deal. Names, dates, amounts, everything the government needs to prosecute everyone involved. Give it to us, the man with the gun ordered, pointing the weapon directly at Richard. No, Richard said calmly. It goes to the FBI and everyone involved faces justice. Including you? Sarah asked. Especially me, Richard replied. I've done terrible things and I need to pay for them. But first, I need to make sure you're safe. The stairwell door burst open and Agent Walsh appeared with 3 other federal agents, all with weapons drawn. FBI, everyone put your hands where we can see them. The man with the gun spun around trying to aim at the agents, but Agent Walsh was faster. Her shot echoed through the hallway and the man dropped his weapon, clutching his shoulder and screaming in pain. Victoria and the other man raised their hands immediately, knowing they were surrounded and outgunned. Sarah, are you hurt? Agent Walsh called out, keeping her weapon trained on the criminals. I'm okay, Sarah replied, her voice shaking with adrenaline. Richard slowly reached into his jacket again and pulled out the USB drive. Agent Walsh, this contains all the evidence you need. Every crime, every participant, everything. As federal agents handcuffed Victoria and her companions, Agent Walsh approached Richard and Sarah. Mr. Blackstone, you're under arrest for money laundering. Conspiracy and multiple federal crimes, she said, but her tone was respectful rather than harsh. I understand, Richard said. He turned to Sarah one last time. I know I don't have the right to ask for forgiveness. I made choices that hurt you and a lot of other people. But I want you to know that giving you up was the hardest thing I ever did. And not a day has passed that I haven't thought about you. Sarah looked at this man who was her father, this criminal who had also tried to protect her, this stranger who had loved her from a distance for 28 years. Will I see you again? She asked. That depends on a lot of things, Richard said honestly. I'm going to prison for a long time. But you'll be taken care of. There are legal trusts set up in your name. Money that was earned legitimately from investments Elena made before she died. You'll never have to worry about being poor again. As Agent Walsh led Richard away in handcuffs, he looked back at Sarah one more time. Elena would be proud of who you've become, he said, and so am I. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the same hallway where her life had changed forever. The Blackstone Industries building had been sold, and she was there for one final visit before it was demolished. The federal investigation had exposed a corruption network that reached into the highest levels of government and business. Dozens of powerful people had been arrested and convicted, and billions of dollars in stolen money had been recovered and returned to the victims of their crimes. Richard Blackstone had received a 20-year prison sentence, but his cooperation with the investigation had helped prosecutors build cases against people who might otherwise have escaped justice. Sarah visited him once a month, slowly building a relationship with the father she had never known. The money Richard had mentioned was real, but Sarah had decided to use most of it to establish a foundation that helped foster children age out of the system with support, education, and opportunities. She kept enough to live comfortably, but her real wealth came from finally knowing who she was and where she came from. Sarah had bought a small house with a yard, and in that yard was a special place where she had buried Max's ashes. Sometimes she would sit there in the evening and tell him about her day, thanking him for being the bridge between her old life and her new one. Agent Walsh had become a friend, helping Sarah navigate the legal complexities of her inheritance and the media attention that came with being the daughter of a notorious criminal. Sarah had learned to use her voice, to speak up for people who were forgotten and invisible the way she had been. Standing in the empty hallway for the last time, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her here. She had started as a forgotten girl with no family and no future. She had lost the only family she knew when Max died, but that loss had led her to discover a truth that changed everything. She wasn't forgotten anymore. She had a father who loved her despite his crimes, a mother's memory to honor, and a purpose that grew out of her own experience of being overlooked and undervalued. As Sarah walked out of the building for the final time, she carried with her the knowledge that even the most powerless people could change the world if they were brave enough to speak the truth when it mattered most. Max had taught her about unconditional love. Richard had taught her about the complexity of family and forgiveness. Agent Walsh had taught her about justice and courage. But most importantly, Sarah had learned that her own story was still being written, and that being forgotten by the world didn't mean she had to forget herself. The girl who had once been invisible was now someone who couldn't be ignored, and she intended to use that visibility to make sure no other child would